It is Wednesday, July 22, 2026. And if you look at the news today, what do a dissolved car engine in New Delhi, a 2,000-pound childcare bill in London, and a massive tech company rationing its own artificial intelligence all have in common? They're all slamming into the exact same invisible wall.
We are tracking this incredible friction across the board today. You have, political efforts trying to forcibly rewire global supply chains while energy markets are dictating local interest rates from thousands of miles away.
And on top of that, the digital economy is suddenly waking up to the staggering real-world price of server compute power. Our mission today is to unpack all these weird incentives and actual human impacts hidden under the headlines.
We should probably start with a deliberate political disruption of trade. Established, hyper-efficient global supply chains are basically being dismantled in real time in favor of localized control.
But the legislative pushback to that is escalating right now. Senator Ron Wyden just introduced a new bill aimed squarely at curbing President Donald Trump's tariff powers. The legislation specifically targets Sections 301, 201, and 232 of the Trade Act.
For anyone who doesn't spend their days reading decades-old trade law, those are essentially the loopholes. They allow the executive branch to bypass Congress and unilaterally impose massive tariffs, usually under the banner of national security or unfair trade practices. Wyden's bill would mandate congressional approval before those levers can be pulled.
The urgency behind that bill makes complete sense when you look at the current proposals. The proposed tariff schedule for imported generic medicines is a perfect case study in how political ambition kind of misreads market mechanics.
It really is. The plan sets the tariff on generic drugs at 0% for 2 years, then escalates it to 100% and finally caps it at 200%. The stated goal is to force pharmaceutical manufacturing back onto U.S. soil.
But the timeline is where that goal completely falls apart. Generic drug makers do not operate like the big brand name pharmaceutical giants who enjoy those 20-year patents and massive profit margins.
They operate on razor-thin margins sustained only by incredible global volume. They compete almost exclusively on price and scale. So a 100% tariff is not a simple tax they can just pass along or absorb. It is effectively an eviction notice from the U.S. market.
Which brings us back to that 2-year grace period. I was looking at industry timelines, and building a domestic pharmaceutical plant is not like setting up a warehouse. It takes a minimum of 4 to 5 years to build, equip, and pass all the FDA certifications for a facility in the United States.
The administration is essentially giving these companies 2 years to complete a 5-year construction project. The physical math is impossible, and the consequence of that impossible math is actually quite severe.
Because this policy does not miraculously create U.S. manufacturing jobs overnight, instead it threatens to force high-volume, low-margin generic producers out of the market entirely, which directly endangers the domestic supply of cheap, everyday medicines, like blood pressure pills and antibiotics, that American consumers rely on.
We are seeing a parallel dynamic unfold in the semiconductor industry right now. TSMC, the world's largest contract chipmaker, has now committed an astronomical $200 billion to U.S. manufacturing. And that is primarily driven by the threat of heavy tariffs, including a recent announcement of an additional $100 billion investment in advanced stateside facilities.
On paper, securing domestic semiconductor production looks like a massive strategic victory. But let us look at the financial reality of what that localized control actually costs.
The cost structure is completely different when you onshore that kind of manufacturing.
Imagine a highly efficient, incredibly profitable, high-volume restaurant. Suddenly, the local government mandates that they can no longer buy ingredients from the global agricultural market. The restaurant must now farm its own tomatoes and raise its own cattle on a vacant lot in the middle of a hyper-expensive downtown city center.
The final product might technically be the same, but the underlying cost structure is ruined. Industry estimates project that U.S.-made chips will cost 20 to 50% more to produce than those manufactured in Taiwan.
And TSMC is already telegraphing to investors that their overall profit margins will be significantly diluted for the next several years as these overseas facilities slowly ramp up.
Because TSMC is not running a charity. That 20 to 50% premium gets passed directly to the major tech companies designing the hardware.
Ultimately, that cost lands squarely on the consumer in the form of much more expensive smartphones, laptops, and data center services. We are trading economic efficiency for geographic security, and the invoice is being sent to the retail buyer. Moving from those intentional trade disruptions, we really have to examine the unintentional shocks radiating outward from global conflict. The energy market is currently exposing how vulnerable domestic economies are to distant geopolitical tensions. As of the episode date, Brent crude oil has spiked to $95 a barrel. That price action is being driven almost entirely by the ongoing U.S.-Israel conflict with Iran and the resulting instability in the Middle East.
Here is the fascinating part about that. That $95 barrel of oil in the Strait of Hormuz is reaching directly into the bank accounts of people living thousands of miles away. Take the United States out of the equation for a moment and look at the UK housing market.
The Bank of England is holding their benchmark interest rate at a painfully high 3.75%. UK consumer price inflation was sitting at 2.6% in June, and policymakers are terrified that sustained $95 oil will push that inflation rate right back up.
We call that mechanism sticky inflation. Energy costs bleed into the logistics of every single product. Oil dictates the cost of the asphalt on the roads, the plastic in the packaging, and the fuel in the delivery trucks.
When oil stays elevated, baseline consumer prices simply cannot fall. The central bank is forced to keep the cost of borrowing high to deliberately suppress economic activity and cool down demand.
The human translation of that macroeconomic policy is devastating for homeowners. The market data shows average two-year fixed mortgages in the UK have climbed to 5.57%. A geopolitical conflict in the Middle East is directly inflating the monthly housing bill of a family living in Manchester.
Those interconnected systems often create bizarre, unintended consequences when governments try to navigate around them. India's current energy strategy is a prime example. The Indian government is desperate to avoid paying a massive premium for Middle Eastern oil, while simultaneously trying to avoid U.S. sanctions associated with buying too much Russian crude.
Their solution was to mandate a 20% agricultural ethanol blend in their gasoline, known as E20. Ethanol is largely made from fermented corn and agricultural waste, and it burns cleaner, which sounds great on paper.
But ethanol is also highly hygroscopic, meaning it actively absorbs moisture from the air. When you force E20 into older vehicles, that trapped water causes the internal metal fuel lines to rust, and the alcohol actively dissolves the rubber engine seals.
This mandate to achieve national energy independence is literally eating away at the engine blocks of older cars across India. Consumers are now filing and winning class action lawsuits against major automakers like Maruti Suzuki because their carburetors are disintegrating from the inside out.
You attempt to solve a macroeconomic energy squeeze through a sweeping top-down mandate, and you end up destroying millions of consumer vehicles. It perfectly illustrates this theme of grand policy colliding with physical reality.
When you bring those punishing costs of capital and energy back home to domestic public finance, you see local governments hitting a structural wall. The acute cost of living reality in the UK is staggering right now.
Official figures from mid-2026 reveal that 7.4 million UK households are currently struggling just to buy basic essentials. That represents a record 62% of all low-income families in the country.
The immediate political response to that kind of data is always to deploy emergency relief. The new UK Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, just moved to reinstate a £2 cap on bus fares and push through a cut to the value-added tax on household electricity.
We have to acknowledge the very real human benefit of those policies. There are reports detailing how rural commuters, like a small shop owner named Sarah, are saving upwards of £500 a year solely because of that bus fare cap. That is tangible money that alters a weekly grocery budget.
However, the funding mechanism behind that relief reveals the deeper problem. To afford those consumer subsidies, the government had to raid over £454 million from long-term structural climate projects. They are applying a localized sticking plaster while the foundation of the house continues to rot.
The most glaring evidence of that rotting foundation is the shifting demographic reality in major cities. We are tracking two specific, crushing financial pressures that are actively pricing the next generation out of existence. First, look at the family formation data in London's Islington borough.
Their fertility rate has collapsed to an astonishingly low 0.99, and the economics of that collapse are incredibly straightforward.
A quick look at the math explains why families are fleeing the area. Average childcare costs in the borough can easily hit £2,000 a month.
Before a family even pays for groceries, utilities, or severely unaffordable London housing, they have to generate £24,000 of post-tax income purely for the privilege of having someone watch a single child.
The baseline cost of living has transformed having children from a biological norm into a luxury good accessible only to the wealthy.
And for the young people who are already here, entering the workforce is becoming increasingly impossible due to employer tax burdens. In the UK, Businesses are required to pay a 15% national insurance tax on any employee earnings above £5,000.
This aggressive tax rate is freezing youth hiring at the entry level. Companies simply cannot justify the tax premium to take a chance on an inexperienced worker.
That creates a vicious cycle. It actively contributes to a massive crisis of young people classified as NEETs, those not in education, employment, or training. The lost economic potential of that sideline generation is currently estimated to cost the UK economy £125 billion annually.
It is a demographic vice grip. Policy has made it too expensive for families to have children and simultaneously made it too expensive for employers to hire the youth who are already here.
If you enjoy understanding the deeper mechanics behind these economic shifts, you can find Financial Candy, Brain Candy, and classic audiobooks at clarineratio.com.
Up to this point, our focus has been heavily tilted toward the physical economy. Shipping routes, oil barrels, pharmaceutical plants, housing costs. The prevailing assumption over the last 3 years was that the digital economy was immune to these physical constraints.
The narrative promised that artificial intelligence was this boundless resource that would seamlessly automate the workforce. And we are seeing real labor displacement matching that narrative.
Stanford data indicates a 12.8% drop in employment for 22 to 25-year-olds in highly AI-exposed sectors, specifically touching finance, copywriting, and entry-level coding.
But the hype train that AI replaces everyone is suddenly slamming into a brutal economic bottleneck. The mechanism behind the AI boom is tethered to literal physical compute power, and that power is quantified in something called tokens.
Which we need to demystify because tokens are the fundamental currency that large language models use to process information. One token equates to roughly 3/4 of a word. Every time an AI reads a prompt, analyzes data, or generates a response, it burns through tokens.
The tech sector has been aggressively deploying autonomous AI agents. These are programs designed to complete complex, multi-step tasks without human supervision. A single agent trying to execute a complex coding sequence might iterate thousands of times, burning through quadrillions of tokens in a matter of hours.
The server costs, the electricity demands, and the raw compute bills have become so astronomically high that top tech companies are now actively rationing their own employees' use of internal AI models.
It is a phenomenal reality check for the Silicon Valley narrative. When you sit down and calculate the cost of the server time required for an AI agent to stumble its way through a complex project, a human intern is suddenly a massive bargain.
The virtual worker is literally pricing itself out of the market because compute power is finite and incredibly expensive to generate. Add the fact that the very data ecosystem feeding these AI models is beginning to revolt.
Reddit's stock dropped 9% today, following reports that the platform might refuse to renew its $60 million a year data sharing agreement with Google.
That fractured relationship points to a massive, systemic crisis in digital media. Google's rollout of AI overviews, where the search engine summarizes answers directly at the top of the page, is so efficient that it is completely cannibalizing the traffic of the websites that actually spent the money to produce that information.
Business Insider, for instance, has seen its search traffic plummet by 85%. Think of it like a farmer deciding to eat all of their seed corn.
The AI models are feasting on the web's data for a short-term harvest of incredible summaries. But by starving those original websites of traffic and ad revenue, the tech giants are guaranteeing those publishers will go bankrupt, meaning there will be nothing new to harvest and train the models on next year.
This extreme volatility in the tech narrative is perfectly encapsulated by what is happening within Elon Musk's empire. Look at the financial pressure on SpaceX. The stock is down 43% from its peak back in June.
They're heading toward a massive event, a 911 million share lockup expiration following their upcoming August 4th earnings debut. For anyone unfamiliar with the mechanics of a lockup expiration, it is an event that floods the market with supply.
When a company debuts or goes through certain funding rounds, early insiders and employees are legally blocked from selling their shares for a specific period. When that lockup expires on August 4th, nearly 1 billion shares can suddenly be dumped onto the open market.
Without an equal tidal wave of new buyer demand, that massive influx of supply crushes the stock price. Meanwhile, over at Tesla, the second quarter earnings report reveals a company attempting a highly precarious pivot.
They are actively shifting capital focus away from their core, revenue-generating electric vehicle sales, and betting their future valuation on unproven, capital-intensive technologies like autonomous robotaxis and Optimus humanoid robots.
They are abandoning their stable foundation to chase speculative tech dreams. If you are an institutional investor surveying this landscape, the picture is terrifying. You see trade policies threatening global supply chains, geopolitical conflict threatening to spike oil, and a tech sector burning immense amounts of cash on AI tokens.
Where does capital go to hide when the macro environment becomes this chaotic? It seeks out the most boring, predictable cash flows imaginable. Capital demands stability when ambition causes volatility.
The perfect current example of this flight to safety is Ball Corporation, the company that literally manufactures aluminum cans.
Exactly the kind of mundane, vital business the market loves right now. They produce the sustainable aluminum packaging for massive, resilient consumer staples like Coca-Cola and Budweiser.
The underlying logic is bulletproof consumers are going to buy canned beverages regardless of whether an AI is rationing its compute tokens or Brent crude is sitting at $95 a barrel. The options market is showing advanced traders utilizing that specific stability to generate yield.
Traders are aggressively selling out-of-the-money August $60 put options on Bullcorp.
Let me back up and break down that option strategy because selling a put option usually involves immense downside risk. I'm essentially selling someone else an insurance policy on their stock. I am promising to buy their shares of Ballcorp at $60 if the market price drops below that level by August. If the broader market tanks, aren't I just catching a falling knife?
The mechanism relies entirely on the underlying safety of the specific asset. By selling that put option, the trader collects a cash premium up front, in this case, roughly $1.20 per contract.
Because Ballcorp possesses incredibly predictable consumer demand, strong projections for free cash flow exceeding 4% by 2027, and historically low volatility following their earnings reports, the risk of a catastrophic price drop is minimal.
The trader is making a calculated bet. They take the premium cash today. The best-case scenario is the stock stays stable, the option expires worthless, and they keep the money.
The absolute worst-case scenario is they are forced to buy shares of a highly profitable, cash-generating monopoly at a discount. It yields a steady return of roughly 2% on committed capital in just a few weeks, completely isolating their portfolio from the unpredictable swings of the tech sector.
The through line connecting all of our sources today is incredibly clear. We are witnessing the unavoidable friction between grand visions and the unforgiving reality of basic economic costs.
Whether it is a political vision to forcibly relocate manufacturing via tariffs, a technological vision to automate the workforce, or a macroeconomic vision to manipulate energy supply, these plans eventually collide with the spreadsheets. They hit the hard limits of what things actually cost to build, power, and maintain in the physical world.
Sometimes, the only way those grand ambitions survive contact with the spreadsheet is if the people in charge get very creative with their accounting.
I want to leave you with a final thought experiment that perfectly captures this dynamic. Consider the current expansion project at Bristol Airport in the UK. They're aggressively pushing a plan to increase their capacity to handle 100,000 commercial flights a year.
At the exact same time, their executives are proudly boasting in press releases that Bristol Airport will achieve net zero carbon emissions by the year 2030. Expanding flight capacity to 100,000 massive commercial jets while claiming a net zero carbon footprint is a mathematical paradox.
The mechanics of how they achieve that paradox are brilliant and terrifying. The airport is installing acres of solar panels on the terminal roofs. They're fitting giant electric heat pumps to warm the administrative buildings and swapping their ground vehicles for electric models.
And they are completely 100% excluding the actual carbon emissions from the airplanes themselves in their net zero calculations.
They simply classify the jet fuel burned in the sky as the airline's problem on a separate ledger. As you navigate the markets and the headlines this week, keep that accounting trick in the back of your mind.
Ask yourself how often in today's economy the official math behind these grand ambitions only works because we have quietly agreed to exclude the most expensive realities from the spreadsheet.
A vital question for a market built on narratives. Thanks for joining us. We will see you next time.